The crowd began laughing before Samuel Reed even reached the demonstration field. His machine could be heard long before it appeared. A slow metallic rhythm came from behind the equipment barn, one heavy ignition, a pause, then another. The sound was rough and uneven, nothing like the smooth engines idling beside the exhibition tents. Then the 1915 machine rolled into view. Its steel body was scarred by rust. Most of the original paint had disappeared decades ago. The exposed flywheel turned beside the engine, throwing brief flashes of sunlight with every rotation. Its tracks moved at the pace of a man walking beside it. There was no cab, no computer, no hydraulic arms. Only iron, grease, shun, and Samuel sitting upright on a narrow steel seat. Several younger farmers raised their phones to record it. One of them laughed. Did he bring that here to work or to donate to the museum? Another pointed toward the smoke rising from the exhaust. Looks like it is already on fire. Samuel heard them. He did not react. He guided the machine across the yard and stopped near a row of polished tractors belonging to Charles Whitmore, the richest landowner in the county. Charles stood beneath a white canopy with local reporters, dealers, and neighboring farmers gathered around him. Behind him waited the centerpiece of the event, a new tractor valued at $475. Ling ling ling. It towered over Samuel's machine. Its rear tires were taller than a man. The glass cabin reflected the sky. Antennas and cameras covered the roof. Digital displays glowed inside like the control panel of an aircraft. Charles smiled when Samuel climbed down. "I thought you were bringing equipment," he said. Samuel wiped grease from his hands with a cloth. "I did." The crowd laughed again. Charles walked around the old machine slowly, enjoying the attention. He tapped one of the metal tracks with the toe of his clean boot. "How old is it?" "Built in 1915. "And it still runs?" "When it has work worth doing." Charles glanced toward the reporters. "You hear that? Apparently the machine chooses its assignments." Samuel folded the cloth and placed it in his pocket. "The operator should." Charles crouched near the exposed engine. A welded repair crossed one section of the frame. Several bolts were mismatched. A fuel line had been replaced with a newer piece of copper tubing. To Charles, every repair looked like proof the machine should have been abandoned. "What does it make?" he asked. 20 horsepower? Close enough." Charles turned and pointed to his modern tractor. "That one produces nearly 500. Samuel looked at it. "I know. It has automatic traction control, satellite guidance, adjustable tire pressure, live field mapping, and enough torque to pull anything on this farm." Samuel studied the enormous tires. Then he looked past the machine toward the western field. The ground there appeared flat and dry, but a dark strip of reeds crossed the lowest section near the tree line. "How much does it weigh?" Samuel asked. Charles smiled. "More than yours?" "That was not my question." The crowd quieted slightly. Charles straightened. "Over 20 tons, depending on the equipment." "And with a full grain cart?" "More." Samuel kept watching the field. 2 days of rain had soaked the lower ground. A thin crust had formed beneath the morning sun, but beneath it the soil would still be holding water. Charles followed his gaze. "The west field is part of today's demonstration." Samuel looked back at him. "You should keep that tractor on the northern rise." Charles gave a short laugh. "The field has already been scanned." "Scanned for what?" "Soil moisture, elevation, compaction risk." Samuel nodded toward the reeds. "And what did it say about that strip?" Charles looked toward one of his technicians. The man checked a tablet. "Moisture is elevated, but still inside the operating limit." Samuel walked a few steps toward the field and pressed the heel of his boot into the ground near the gate. When he lifted it, water shone inside the print. He scraped away the surface with his toe. The soil beneath was dark and soft. Charles watched him. "You are judging the whole field from one footprint?" "No." Samuel pointed toward the reeds. "I am judging it from the plants, the color, the slope, and the water rising under my boot. Charles shook his head. This is exactly why farming had to change. Guesswork. Superstition. Old men, reading weeds like fortune tellers. Samuel turned toward him. The weeds are not guessing. A few people stopped smiling. Charles stepped closer to the old machine. I have made you an offer before. Samuel said nothing. I will make it again. I will buy this thing for scrap. More than the metal is worth. You clear space in your barn, and I remove a machine that belongs in the past. Samuel looked at the exposed flywheel. His father had taught him to start it. His grandfather had worked beside it. Every repair on the frame carried the memory of a season when replacing it had not been possible. But sentiment was not why Samuel kept it. He placed one hand on the steel track. It still does jobs. Your tractor cannot. Charles glanced at the massive modern machine and laughed. What job could this possibly do better? Samuel looked once more toward the wet strip in the western field. Cross ground without asking it to carry more than it can. Charles spread his arms toward the crowd. There it is. The final defense of old equipment. It is slow, weak, uncomfortable, and inefficient, but at least it is light. Samuel met his eyes. Light can be useful. Charles turned toward his driver. Start the demonstration. The modern tractor came alive with a deep, controlled roar. Its digital lights brightened. The cabin sealed. The giant tires began rolling toward the west field. The crowd shifted to follow. Samuel remained beside his 1915 machine. One young farmer stopped near him. You really think that antique could beat his tractor? Samuel watched the modern machine approach the dark strip of reeds. No. The young man grinned. At least you admit it. Samuel placed the grease cloth back in his pocket. A machine does not beat another machine by being stronger. The young man frowned. Samuel listened as the modern tractor changed gears in the distance. It wins by finishing the work the other one cannot. Charles Whitmore had built his reputation by replacing uncertainty with control. He had expanded his farm from a few hundred acres to several thousand by buying neighboring properties, standardizing the work, and investing in equipment most local farmers could never afford. To Charles, old methods were not wisdom. They were inefficiency that had survived too long. The $475,000 tractor was the clearest symbol of that belief. It stood near the western field with its engine idling smoothly, larger than every other machine in the demonstration yard. Its tires rose above the shoulders of the men gathered beside it. Cameras were mounted around the cab. Satellite receivers sat on the roof. Inside, 3 screens displayed field boundaries, wheel slip, engine load, fuel use, and soil conditions in real time. Charles climbed onto a small platform beside the machine. This tractor can work longer, straighter, and faster than any operator using conventional equipment, he told the crowd. A reporter raised her hand. How much labor does it replace? Charles smiled. That depends on the job. But on this farm, one machine can now complete in a day what used to require several tractors and an entire crew. The dealers applauded first. Then the neighboring farmers. Samuel stood near the edge of the crowd, listening. Charles continued. The machine adjusts tire pressure automatically. It redistributes torque when one wheel loses traction. It reads terrain, controls implement depth, and follows satellite guidance within inches. He pointed toward the western field. Today, it will cross that section, pull a loaded grain cart, and finish before the weather changes. Samuel looked toward the sky. Clouds were gathering beyond the low hills, still distant but moving steadily east. He stepped closer to the tractor. The driver had already loaded the field map. On the screen, most of the route appeared green. A narrow yellow band crossed the lower section where the reeds grew. Samuel pointed to it. What does yellow mean? The technician standing beside the cab glanced at the display. Elevated moisture. Still within operational tolerance. What depth? The technician hesitated. The sensor network measures several depths. That was not my question. Charles stepped between them. The system has enough information. Samuel looked at the tractor's rear axle. The machine itself weighed more than 20 tons. The grain cart behind it would add thousands of pounds more once loaded. How much of that weight reaches each axle? Samuel asked. Charles laughed quietly. You planning to redesign it? No. Then why does it matter? Samuel pointed toward the lower field. Because that soil does not care what the machine cost. It only feels the weight. Charles folded his arms. The tires are engineered to distribute that weight. On firm ground, they are designed for wet conditions. Wet is not one condition. The crowd had become quieter. Samuel continued. Wet clay behaves one way. Wet sand behaves another. Peat behaves differently again. That lower strip has roots holding a skin over softer ground. The technician looked at the map. The system does not classify it as peat. Samuel nodded. That does not mean there is none. Charles turned toward the crowd. This is the argument we have heard for years. Every time technology advances, someone says the land is too complicated. The machines are too large. Or the old ways understood, something science missed. Samuel met his eyes. Sometimes they did. Charles pointed toward the 1915 machine waiting near the barn. That machine has no soil sensor. No. No satellite map. No. No automated traction control. No. Then how could it possibly know more? Samuel looked down at his boots. It does not know anything. He looked back at Charles. The operator is supposed to blank. A few people murmured. Charles smiled. But the smile had become harder. Then let us settle this with work. He motioned to the driver. The cab door closed. The tractor shifted into gear and moved toward the field. Its engine barely changed tone. The grain cart followed behind. Empty for the first pass. The guidance system lined the machine perfectly with the planned route. The crowd moved toward the fence. Phones rose into the air. The machine entered the field without hesitation. At first, it performed exactly as Charles had promised. The tires left broad but shallow impressions. The tractor held a straight path across the higher ground. Its speed remained constant. The technician watched the numbers on his tablet. Wheel slip under 6%. Charles nodded. Within target. The tractor advanced toward the yellow band. Samuel watched the reeds. They leaned slightly, although the wind had not changed. That was not the wind moving them. It was the ground. The heavy machine approached the low section. Its front tires crossed first without difficulty. Then the rear tires reached the darker soil. The left side dipped. Only slightly. The technician looked down at the screen. 8% slip. Charles did not react. The tractor continued. The right rear tire dropped next. 11%. The technician said. The system adjusted automatically. Tire pressure fell. Torque shifted. The tractor pulled forward another 10 feet. The crowd saw only the machine continuing to work. Samuel saw the surface beginning to break. Dark soil pushed outward from the tire edges. Water appeared in the tread marks. The reeds behind the tractor trembled again. Samuel turned to Charles. Stop it now. Charles kept his eyes on the machine. It is still moving. That is when you stop. The technician checked the display. Slip is 14%. But the system is compensating. Samuel's voice hardened. Compensating by putting more force into ground that is already failing. Charles ignored him. The engine deepened as the tractor increased power. For a moment, the machine surged forward. The crowd applauded. Then the rear tires broke through the surface. The tractor dropped hard enough to tilt the grain cart behind it. Mud rose around both wheels. The engine roared. The machine moved another foot. Then stopped. The screen on the technician's tablet changed from yellow to red. Charles stared at it. What happened? The technician enlarged the readings. Wheel slip 42%. Rear axle load rising. Tell him to keep moving. Samuel turned sharply. No. Charles looked at him. If he stops now, it may settle. If he keeps spinning, It will day. Charles raised the radio. Maintain forward power. The driver answered from inside the cab. Copy. The tires began turning faster. Mud sprayed behind the tractor. The machine did not move. Samuel looked toward his 1,915 machine waiting near the barn. No one was laughing now. The modern tractor still had nearly 500 horsepower. It simply had nowhere left to put it. The tractor's rear tires continued spinning. Mud rose in thick waves behind them, then slid back into the holes they had created. The machine's engine remained strong, but the body no longer moved forward. Charles lowered the radio. Reduce throttle. Try reverse. Inside the cab, the driver changed direction. The tires rotated backward. For half a second, the tractor lifted. Then the left wheel dropped deeper. The grain cart shifted behind it, pulling the rear frame slightly downhill. The crowd stepped closer to the fence. No one was filming now. Samuel walked past Charles and entered the field. "Where are you going?" Charles called. "To find out what your machine is standing on. You can see it." "Mud." Samuel kept walking. "Mud is what happened. It is not the reason." Near the gate, the soil held his weight. His boots left shallow impressions. Farther in, the ground changed. Each step produced a faint trembling around the reeds. Water appeared inside his footprints a moment after he lifted his boots. Samuel stopped. He pressed the end of his walking stick into the surface. The first few inches were soft, then the stick broke through. It sank almost to the handle. The crowd watched from the fence. Samuel pulled it out slowly. Dark topsoil coated the upper section. Beneath it was a black, fibrous layer filled with half-decayed roots and plant material. Water ran from it in thin streams. Cole Mason, Charles's farm manager, entered the field behind him. "What is that?" Samuel rubbed the material between his fingers. "Old organic ground. Peat? Some of it." Charles joined them, stepping carefully around the deepest prints. "The soil survey does not show a peat field." Samuel looked toward the line of reeds. "It is not the whole field." He moved several yards sideways and pushed the stick down again. This time it met firm resistance after 8 inches. Samuel returned to the first location and repeated the test. The stick disappeared almost 2 feet before touching anything solid. "There," he said. Charles frowned. "There what?" "The edge." "Of what?" Samuel pointed along the reeds. "A buried wet strip. Maybe an old marsh channel. Maybe part of the field that was filled years ago." The ground appeared level because generations of plowing had smoothed the surface. But below it, the soil was not uniform. On the northern rise, mineral soil sat close to the top. Across the low band, decayed plants and wet organic material remained trapped above denser layers. The surface roots formed a thin mat strong enough to carry a person, not strong enough to carry a 20-ton tractor and a grain cart. Charles opened the field map on his tablet. The area was marked as one continuous soil zone, no wetland boundary, he said. Samuel looked at the screen. "Because the boundary is under your boots." Charles showed him the moisture readings. Values were elevated, not dangerous. Samuel took the tablet, but did not study it for long. "These numbers tell you how much water was measured where the sensors were placed." He handed it back. "They do not tell you how the ground will carry weight everywhere between them." Cole pointed toward the trapped tractor. It crossed the front wheels without trouble. The front axle was lighter, Samuel said. Then the rear axle and the cart reached the same spot. He walked toward the machine, stopping several yards away. The rear tires had broken completely through the root mat. Pieces of grass and fibrous soil hung from the tread. Water now filled the ruts faster than the tires could throw it out. Samuel knelt near the edge and lifted a section of torn ground. It came up like a heavy carpet. Underneath was black, saturated material with almost no structure. He held it toward Charles. "This is what carried the first part of the machine." Then he dropped it. "And this is what the tires destroyed." Charles looked at the shredded surface. The tires are designed to spread weight. They did. Samuel pointed to the broken mat. But once the surface failed, the weight had nowhere to spread. The machine had not simply sunk into loose mud, it had broken through a load-bearing layer formed by roots and partially decomposed plant matter. Beneath that skin, the wet, organic soil compressed and shifted under pressure. Every tire rotation tore the surface wider. Every increase in torque pushed the tractor deeper. Cole looked across the low strip. How wide is it? Samuel studied the reeds, the darker vegetation, and the slight depression leading toward the western trees. 40 yards here, wider near the lower end. Charles glanced toward the planned route. The tractor had been scheduled to cross that strip repeatedly while pulling a loaded grain cart. If it had made the first pass? Samuel looked at him. The second pass would have found weaker ground. The first crossing would have damaged the route mat even if the tractor had continued moving. Repeated traffic would have concentrated weight in the same tracks until the surface collapsed. The failure was not an accident caused by one unlucky tire position. It was built into the route. Charles studied the field map again. The guidance line crossed the wet strip at its widest point because it was the shortest route between the crop rows and the unloading area. The software had optimized distance. It had not understood carrying capacity. Samuel walked parallel to the reeds until he reached a patch of firm ground farther north. He pushed the stick down. It stopped after several inches. This is the route. Charles looked at the longer path. That adds nearly half a mile to every cycle. It also keeps the tractor above ground. A few farmers near the fence laughed quietly. Charles heard them. His face tightened. He pointed back toward Samuel's machine. And your antique could cross the wet strip? Samuel looked toward the 1915 machine. Its long tracks rested on the dry yard, each track spreading the machine's smaller weight across a broad contact area. Maybe. Charles smiled coldly. Maybe? Only a fool promises what the ground has not yet allowed. Charles stepped closer. You have spent the morning telling everyone your machine can do what mine cannot. No. Samuel looked toward the buried tires. I said it still has work worth doing. He walked back to the edge of the rut and pushed his stick beneath the torn root mat. The ground moved around it like a soaked sponge. The tractor's engine idled above them, powerful and useless. Samuel looked at Charles. Your machine did not lose to mine. Then what did it lose to? Samuel pointed down. The field beneath the field. Samuel returned to the edge of the field, with black organic soil still clinging to his fingers. Charles stood beside the technician, staring at the red warning zone spreading across the tablet screen. The tractor remained motionless in the low strip. Its engine idled heavily. The grain cart leaned behind it at a slight angle, one wheel resting lower than the other. Samuel looked at the driver through the glass cab. Shut it down. Charles did not move. The machine is still stable. No, Samuel said. It is still upright. Charles turned toward the technician. What does the system show? Wheel slip is down because the driver stopped moving. Rear axle load is elevated. Tire pressure control is active. Any mechanical fault? Not yet. Charles looked at Samuel. You hear that? Nothing is broken. Samuel pointed toward the rear wheels. The ground is. Charles raised the radio. Try a slow reverse. Lowest gear. Samuel stepped between him and the field. Do that, and you tear the last firm edge behind the tires. Charles lowered the radio slowly. You have made your point. I am trying to keep you from making the problem worse. The crowd had gathered closer now. Farmers who had laughed at Samuel's machine stood along the fence, watching the exchange. Charles could feel their attention. That made stopping harder. The demonstration had been designed to prove that his new tractor could outperform every older machine in the county. Dealers had traveled to see it. A reporter had already photographed him beside the cab. If he shut the machine down after one failed pass, the story would not be about wet ground. It would be about Charles Whitmore being warned by an old farmer and refusing to listen. He looked toward the western sky. The storm remained several hours away. There is still time, he said. Samuel followed his gaze. For what? To free it. With what? The second tractor. Samuel's expression changed. No. Charles pointed toward a large machine parked beside the equipment tents. It has enough weight and power to pull from the northern side. The northern side crosses the same wet band. We can approach at an angle. You will put another heavy machine on ground you already know cannot carry the first. Charles looked toward Cole. Bring it around. Cole did not move immediately. Charles, maybe we should test the route first. The route is firmer. Samuel shook his head. It looks firmer. Charles turned on him. That is all you ever say. Looks. Feels. Plants. Footprints. Samuel stepped closer. Because the ground keeps answering those questions. My system uses actual measurements. Then measure the one thing that matters. Charles frowned. What? Whether the soil can carry the load. The technician looked down at the tablet. We do not have direct bearing, capacity data for this exact strip. Charles gave him a sharp glance. You said the field was inside operating limits. For moisture. Samuel nodded. There it is. Charles ignored him and faced Cole again. Move the second tractor to the northern rise. Keep it out of the reeds. Cole hesitated. Then signaled the driver. The second machine started. Its engine rolled across the field with a deep mechanical growl. Samuel watched it move toward the gate. You are about to repeat the same mistake with a different machine. Charles folded his arms. This one will remain on high ground. There is no high ground between the gate and the pulling angle you want. The map shows a rise. The map shows elevation. It does not show the soft pocket beneath the grass. Charles laughed without humor. Convenient. Samuel's eyes hardened. What is? Every time the data disagrees with you, you claim there is something hidden underground. Samuel pointed toward the trap tractor. There is. The second tractor entered the field. For the first 30 yards, the ground held. Its tires left broad impressions, but did not sink. Charles looked at Samuel. Firm enough? Samuel watched the grass ahead of it. A faint shimmer of water appeared in the previous tire marks. Stop it. Charles said nothing. The machine continued. Another 10 yards. The front tires crossed a slight depression. The left side dipped. Cole saw it first. Hold. The driver stopped. Water slowly rose into the nearest track. The machine had not sunk badly. But the warning was clear. Samuel walked to the tire mark and pressed his boot into the center. The surface gave way beneath him. He turned toward Charles. You have one trap tractor. Do you want two? Charles looked at the second machine. Then at the crowd. For several seconds, pride fought calculation. Calculation finally won. He raised the radio, back out along the same line. Slowly. The second tractor reversed. Its tires climbed from the depression and returned to firm ground. No one laughed. Samuel walked back toward the original machine. Charles followed him. So what do you suggest? Samuel pointed toward the northern rise. Farther from the shortest route. You build from there? Build what? A way to move the work. Charles looked at the trap tractor. I need that machine out. You need the harvest finished before the storm. That tractor is how we finish it. Samuel shook his head. That is the mistake. Charles stared at him. The machine is not the job. Samuel pointed toward the unharvested crop beyond the wet strip. That is the job. The wind strengthened across the field. The reeds bent low, revealing the darker ground beneath them. Samuel looked toward his 1,915 machine waiting beside the barn. Charles followed his eyes. You think that antique can pull mine free? No. Then why do you keep looking at it? Because it can still reach the work. Charles glanced at the exposed flywheel, the rusted frame, and the long steel tracks. The old machine looked absurd beside the modern tractors. Too slow. Too small. Too old. Charles almost smiled again. Then he looked back at the western field. The unharvested crop moved beneath the approaching wind. What exactly are you proposing? Samuel turned toward the barn. We stopped trying to prove which tractor is stronger. He began walking, and we find out which one can still finish the day. The modern tractor had not failed because it was weak. It had failed because every system inside it was designed to find more traction, while the field had already stopped offering any. Inside the cab, the driver watched the wheel slip indicator climb. 18%, 26, 34. The tractor's computer reacted faster than any human could. It lowered tire pressure, redistributed torque, locked the differential, and adjusted engine output. For a moment, the rear tires slowed. Then the left tire spun again. The root mat beneath it tore open. Black water surged into the rut. The tractor dropped another inch. Charles stood near the fence with the technician beside him. What is it doing now? Trying to recover grip. Then give it more power. The technician shook his head. More power is what is breaking the surface. Charles looked at him sharply. It has nearly 500 horsepower. Samuel had heard enough. He stepped closer to the field. 500 horses cannot pull against water. Charles turned. It is not sitting in water. Samuel pointed toward the rear tires. It is now. The tractor's wide tires had been designed to spread weight across firm soil, but the moment they broke through the living mat of roots, that advantage disappeared. The weight dropped onto saturated organic ground below. The soil compressed. Water was forced upward. The tread filled with black peat until the deep lugs looked almost smooth. The more the wheels turned, the less they could grip. Inside the cab, another warning appeared. Excessive wheel slip. The driver eased off the throttle. The tractor stopped digging. For several seconds, it simply sat there. Then the grain cart settled lower behind it. Its weight pulled backward against the hitch. Samuel watched the connection between the two machines. Unhook the cart. Charles stared at him. With the tractor sitting in that, the cart is adding dead weight. And how do you expect anyone to reach the hitch? Carefully. From the high side. Charles shook his head. We are not leaving a loaded cart in the field. It is not loaded. That is not the point. Samuel looked at him. That is exactly the point. The crowd had gone silent again. Charles was still thinking about the demonstration. Samuel was thinking about the next 10 minutes. Cole approached from the northern rise. The second tractor is back on firm ground. Good, Samuel said. Charles looked toward the trapped machine. What happens if we try a straight pull from the gate? Samuel drew a line in the soil with his boot. The cable will pull backward along the same trench the tires already made. So the wheels will climb the walls of mud only if there is something firm beneath them. He scraped away the dark top layer with his heel. Water rose immediately. There is not. Charles folded his arms. What about pulling from the side? You risk twisting the frame or tipping the cart. The technician nodded reluctantly. He is right about the angle. Charles looked from one man to the other. He was not accustomed to hearing agreement against him. The driver radioed from the cab. I have a drivetrain warning. The technician lifted the tablet. A red icon had appeared beside the transmission readout. What kind? Charles asked. Protection mode. The system sees high load with no forward movement. Clear it. I can reset it. But if the condition remains, it will return. Then override it. There is no field override. Charles stared at him. You are telling me the tractor can move, but the computer will not let it? It is protecting the drivetrain. Samuel looked toward the cab. The machine finally learned to stop. Charles ignored him. The technician attempted the reset. For several seconds, the warning disappeared. Then the driver engaged reverse. The engine rose. The tires turned half a rotation. Mud rolled beneath them. The warning returned immediately. This time, the system reduced power. The engine still sounded strong, but the tractor barely responded to the throttle. Charles raised the radio. Why are you not moving? I have limited output. The driver replied. It will not give me full torque. Samuel looked at Charles. Good. Charles turned on him. Good? If the computer gave him everything, He would bury the axle. Charles stepped closer. You seem pleased. I am pleased the machine has one system smarter than its owner. The words landed harder than Samuel intended. For a moment, neither man spoke. The crowd waited. Charles's face hardened. This is my farm. Samuel nodded. And that is your tractor. He pointed toward the wet strip. But neither of those facts changes the soil. A gust of wind moved through the reeds. The plants bent low, exposing a dark line of standing water. The storm was closer now. Cole checked the western sky. We may have 2 hours. Charles looked toward the unharvested field. Rows of grain stretched beyond the trapped machine. If the rain arrived before the work was finished, several acres could be lost. He turned back to the tractor. Can we free it in 2 hours? Samuel did not answer immediately. He studied the depth of the rear tires, the angle of the cart, and the distance to firm ground. Not without building a road under it. How long? Longer than the storm will give us. Charles glanced toward Samuel's old machine. So your antique cannot rescue it? No. The faintest trace of satisfaction returned to Charles's face. Samuel saw it. You still think this is a contest? Charles said nothing. Samuel pointed beyond the trapped tractor, toward the crop. The storm does not care which machine wins. He turned toward the 1,915 machine. What matters is whether the work continues. Charles looked at the old crawler's wide tracks. It had less than a fraction of the power, no sensors, no sealed cab, no automatic system to protect itself. Yet it remained on firm ground, ready to move. What can it do? Charles asked. Samuel looked toward the equipment barn. Not everything. Then he looked back at the field. Just enough. Charles still believed the tractor could be recovered with the right command. The technician stood beside the field, with a diagnostic tablet connected to the machine remotely. Red warnings filled the screen. Drivetrain protection, active. Wheel speed mismatch. Excessive load detected. Hydraulic pressure limited. Charles pointed at the first warning. Clear that. The technician entered the reset code. The message disappeared, then returned. He tried again. The tractor's engine changed tone, but the wheels did not move. Charles stared toward the cab. What is stopping it? The system sees the rear wheels turning without enough vehicle movement. I know that. Override it. I cannot. Charles turned sharply. You represent the manufacturer. I can diagnose the fault. I cannot remove a protection limit that is built into the control software. The answer seemed impossible to Charles. He had paid for power. The machine had power, yet a line of code had decided that he could not use it. Samuel stood a few yards away, watching black water collect around the tires. The machine is protecting itself, he said. Charles did not look at him. It is preventing us from working. It is preventing you from turning a difficult repair into a destroyed transmission. Charles stepped closer to the technician. What if we disconnect the sensor? The technician shook his head. The tractor may refuse to engage at all. What if we replace it? We do not know whether the sensor is faulty. It is covered in mud. So are 3 others. Charles looked toward the machine. Its engine still ran. Its headlights still burned. The cab remained dry and quiet. From a distance, it looked ready. But the tractor was now trapped by 2 different systems. The field would not support its weight. The computer would not release its full power. Samuel looked beneath the rear axle. The mud had risen close enough to touch the lower housing, shut down the engine. Charles ignored him. Why? Vibration. That engine barely vibrates. Enough to keep working the tires lower while the soil settles. The technician nodded. He is right. There is no advantage to idling. Charles hesitated, then raised the radio. Shut it down. The engine stopped. The sudden silence changed the field. Without the machinery, everyone could hear water dripping from the tire treads. Wind moved through the reeds. Somewhere beyond the low ground, thunder rolled. The driver opened the cab door. Do I climb down? Samuel looked at the distance between the steps and the mud. Not on that side. The high side of the tractor still sat several inches above the surrounding ground. Cole carried two short boards across the firmer edge and laid them below the cab. The driver stepped down carefully. When his weight reached the second board, black water rose around it. He moved quickly to firm ground. Charles watched him approach. You felt nothing mechanical? No. It responded normally until the system limited output, so the tractor is not broken. The driver glanced back at the buried tires. Not yet. Samuel heard the answer. That was the real danger. The machine still had value because its safeguards had stopped Charles before he forced a mechanical failure, but Charles saw the same protection as a defect. He was trying to make the tractor obey a command that the ground had already made impossible. Charles turned toward Samuel. You said your machine can still reach the work? It can reach the northern side. Across that wet strip, along its edge. And then what? Samuel pointed toward the equipment barn. There is an old belt-driven thresher behind it. Charles stared at him. You want to finish the harvest with museum equipment? I want to use the dry route. Bring the crop out with smaller wagons. And process it on firm ground. That will take twice as many people. Yes. It will take longer. Yes. It will be less efficient. Samuel looked toward the storm. Less efficient than what? Charles followed his gaze to the modern tractor. The machine had been selected because it could combine several operations, reduce labor, and move large loads in fewer passes. All of those advantages depended on mobility. Now the tractor had become the least efficient machine on the property. It consumed time without performing work. It required a technician, a manager, and half the crew simply to keep it from sinking further. Charles pointed at Samuel's crawler. That machine cannot pull a modern grain cart. It does not need to. It cannot harvest the crop. It can power the equipment that does. It has barely 20 horsepower. Samuel nodded. Then we will ask it for 20 horsepower. Charles gave a bitter laugh. You expect that to save the field? No. Samuel looked toward the unharvested grain. I expect it to save the work we can still reach. Cole stepped between them. Charles, the storm line moved faster. Weather station says rain in 90 minutes. The crowd reacted quietly. Some looked toward their trucks. Others looked toward the field, trying to judge how much crop remained. Charles pulled up the forecast on his tablet. The radar showed a heavy band moving east. He enlarged it twice. There was no longer time for pride. How many acres? He asked. Cole checked the harvest plan. About 14 on the western side. How much can we move before the rain? With the main tractor. All of it. Charles looked toward the silent machine. And without it? Cole did not answer. Samuel did. Enough to matter. Charles looked at the 1,915 machine. It stood low beside the barn, black with oil and age. Its steel tracks were wide relative to its weight. Its engine could be reached with a wrench. Its output could be transferred through a simple belt. Nothing about it was impressive by modern standards. But it did not need a software reset. It did not need a service vehicle. It did not need the wet field to become firm. Charles turned to Cole. How many small wagons still run? 4. Labor? 12 people here? More if we call the South crew. Charles looked at Samuel. And the thresher? It ran last season. Can you start it? If the belt is sound. Charles exhaled slowly. The decision cost him more than money. It meant accepting Samuel's plan in front of everyone who had come to watch his demonstration. Do it, he said. Samuel did not smile. He turned toward the barn. Then stopped treating the old machine like a contestant. Charles frowned. What should I treat it as? Samuel began walking. A tool. Samuel did not drive toward the trapped tractor. That surprised everyone. The crowd had expected a confrontation between two machines. The rusted crawler from 1,915 against the $475,000 tractor buried in the wet strip. Charles expected it too. He followed Samuel toward the barn. You said your machine could still reach the work. It can. Then prove it. Samuel stopped beside the old crawler. By doing what? Charles pointed toward the field. Pull mine out. Samuel looked at the modern tractor, then at the soft ground around it. No. The answer came so quickly that Charles almost thought he had misheard. You have spent all morning telling me that machine still matters. It does. Then use it. I intend to. Charles stepped closer. Use it to pull the tractor. Samuel shook his head. That would be stupid. Several people near the barn went silent. Charles's face tightened. You are refusing because it cannot do it. I am refusing because no machine should be asked to solve the wrong problem. Charles looked toward the crowd. There were reporters among them. Dealers. Neighbors. Men who had laughed at Samuel less than an hour earlier. He raised his voice. You heard him? The antique cannot pull the tractor. Samuel opened the crawler's fuel valve. I never said it could. Then it has already lost. Samuel turned. Lost what? The contest? There is no contest. Charles gave a hard smile. There is now. He stepped into the open space between the machines. My tractor entered the field to finish 14 acres before the storm. Your machine is supposed to be the wiser choice. If it cannot recover mine, what exactly has it proven? Samuel looked past him toward the unharvested crop. That you still think the tractor is the job? Charles pointed at the trapped machine. That tractor is how the job gets done. It was. The words struck Charles harder than Samuel intended. Samuel continued. Now it is an obstacle. Charles stared at him. The distinction was simple, but it changed everything. The modern tractor had been the center of the harvest plan. Every wagon, route, worker, and timing decision had been built around it. Once it stopped, the entire system stopped. Samuel's old crawler could not replace 500 horsepower, but it did not need to. It only needed to help rebuild the system around a different method. Samuel pointed toward the barn. We moved the thresher to firm ground. Then he pointed toward the northern rise. Small wagons bring the crop around the wet strip. Cole studied the route. That adds distance. It avoids the ground that buried the large tractor. What about harvesting? The smaller binder can still cut the standing grain. Cole looked toward an older machine parked behind the barn. It has not run in years. Samuel nodded. Then today is a good day to find out whether it still can. Charles laughed once. You want to replace one modern machine with a chain of old ones? No. Samuel climbed onto the crawler. I want to divide one impossible job into several possible jobs. That was the difference between their systems. Charles had concentrated speed, power, and control into one machine. Samuel planned to separate the work. One light machine would cut. Small wagons would carry. The crawler would power the stationary thresher. More people would be involved. More coordination would be required. The work would be slower. But no single failure could stop everything. Charles looked toward the radar on his tablet. Rain in 78 minutes. How long to set up? Samuel glanced at the thresher. 20 minutes if the belt is sound. And if it is not, then we shorten it. You say that as though it is simple. It is simple. Samuel looked at the modern tractor. Simple does not mean easy. He engaged the crawler. The engine struck its familiar rhythm. One heavy ignition. A pause. Another. The steel tracks began moving. Samuel drove past the trapped tractor without turning toward it. The crowd shifted aside. Some looked confused. Others began to understand. Charles walked beside the crawler. You are leaving my machine in the field. For now? What if the rain reaches it? It is already wet. What if it sinks farther? It may. Charles grabbed the side rail. Then why are we not saving it first? Samuel stopped the machine. Because iron can wait. He pointed toward the grain moving in the wind. That cannot. The storm would not destroy the tractor in one afternoon. But heavy rain could flatten the crop. Increase losses. and make the remaining field unreachable for days. Charles had been measuring risk by the value of the machine. Samuel was measuring risk by what time could not restore. Cole called the south crew. Workers uncovered the old thresher and checked its bearings. 2 men rolled the drive belt across the yard. Others fueled the smaller binder and hitched the 4 light wagons. The quiet demonstration field became a working farm. Samuel positioned the crawler on firm ground beside the thresher. He aligned the flywheel with the belt pulley. The 2 machines had to sit at the correct distance and angle. Too close, and the belt would sag. Too far, and the strain could damage the bearings. Samuel adjusted the crawler twice. Charles watched. "You did not measure it." Samuel looked along the belt. "I did." "With what?" "My eyes." Charles shook his head. Samuel stepped beside him. "The belt tells you when it is straight." He pointed to its edges. "If one side begins walking off the pulley, the machines are not aligned." Cole spun the thresher pulley by hand. It moved stiffly. Samuel opened a bearing cap. The grease inside had hardened. "Clean all 4, he said. Workers brought rags and fresh lubricant. Charles checked the time. 64 minutes. Samuel inspected the belt. A crack ran halfway across one section. Cole saw it. "That will not hold." Samuel touched the damaged rubber. "It will, if we remove this section. We lose 6 feet. We have more belt than we need." He marked the material, cut away the cracked portion, and rejoined the ends with an old metal fastener from the barn. Charles watched him hammer the connection flat. "You keep parts for everything?" "No." Samuel lifted the repaired belt. "I keep useful things until I know they are useless." The workers stretched it between the crawler and the thresher. Samuel turned the old machine's flywheel by hand. The belt moved. It stayed centered. He climbed onto the seat. Charles stood beside him. "You still have not beaten my tractor." Samuel opened the throttle, slightly. "I'm not trying to." The crawler engine accelerated. The long belt tightened and began moving in a dark blur. Across the yard, the thresher shook awake. Its pulleys turned. Its internal drums began to rotate. Dust rose from the wooden housing. Workers cheered. Beyond them, the modern tractor remained silent in the field. Charles looked from one machine to the other. Samuel leaned toward him over the engine noise. "Your tractor was built to do many jobs at once." He pointed to the crawler, the thresher, the wagons, and the waiting crew. "This system only works if every part does one job well." The first wagon moved toward the northern route. The binder started behind it. The harvest had begun again. Charles looked toward the storm. For the first time since the tractor sank, something on the farm was moving in the right direction. Samuel's machine had not pulled the modern tractor from the mud. It had done something more important. It had made the trapped machine irrelevant. The 1915 crawler had been running for less than 10 minutes when the first wagon reached the northern rise. The smaller binder moved ahead of it, cutting a narrow section of grain and laying the stalks in orderly rows. 2 workers followed, lifting the bundles onto the wagon by hand. It was slower than Charles's normal system. Much slower. But it was moving. Samuel stood beside the crawler, one hand on the throttle lever and the other resting near the exposed flywheel. The old engine fired in a steady rhythm. Each stroke passed through the pulley, into the long belt, and across the yard to the thresher. The belt moved so quickly that its surface blurred. The thresher shook as grain heads entered the drum. Clean kernels poured from one side. Straw left the other. Charles watched the first full sack hit the ground. He looked toward the trapped tractor. Its engine was silent. Its cab windows reflected the storm clouds. The huge tires remained buried in the wet strip. Beside it, the $475,000 machine looked powerful even at rest. The old crawler did not. It looked like a collection of exposed parts that should have stopped working decades ago. Yet the grain kept falling. Cole approached Samuel. "Drum speed is low." Samuel listened to the thresher. "Not by much." We can increase the crawler. Samuel looked toward the belt. Not yet. Charles stepped closer. We are losing time. Samuel pointed toward the grain outlet. We are gaining grain. At half the normal rate. At a rate the field can support. Charles checked the radar. The storm was less than an hour away. Open the throttle. Samuel did not move. The thresher has been standing too long. We let the bearings warm gradually. It is a machine, not a horse. Samuel looked at him. Metal expands too. He placed 2 fingers against the bearing housing. Then removed them. Still cool. Charles shook his head. Your entire method is based on waiting. No. Samuel watched the belt. It is based on not breaking the only system we have left. Another wagon arrived. Workers unloaded the bundles into a growing stack beside the thresher. The feeder began passing them into the drum one at a time. The old machine's rhythm deepened under the additional load. The belt dipped once between the pulleys. Samuel noticed immediately. He moved the throttle forward a fraction. The engine sped up. The belt tightened. The thresher returned to a steady sound. Charles noticed the adjustment. You could have done that earlier. It did not need it earlier. The answer irritated him because it revealed the difference between Samuel and the modern system. Charles's tractor used sensors to make hundreds of adjustments every minute. Samuel made only a few, but each one came after listening to the load, watching the belt, and feeling the temperature of the bearings. He was not reacting slower. He was refusing to react before the machine gave him a reason. The third bundle entered the thresher. A sharp slap sounded from the belt. Samuel shut the throttle immediately. The crawler slowed. The thresher coasted to a stop. Workers looked up. Charles checked the sky. What happened? Samuel walked to the belt connection. The metal fastener had shifted. One side of the repaired joint stood slightly higher than the other. It is walking out. Cole examined it. Can we run it? For a few minutes. Then run it. Samuel looked at the pulley. If the fastener catches the edge, it tears the belt. Charles stepped forward. How long to repair? 5 minutes. We may not have 5. Samuel removed a hammer and flat punch from the toolbox mounted on the crawler. If we do not take 5 now, we may lose 40 later. He released the tension and pulled the joint onto a wooden block. 2 blows flattened the raised edge. A third secured the fastener. Then he checked the rest of the belt by hand. Charles watched the work. There was no service code, no replacement part arriving from another county, no diagnostic screen explaining the failure. There was only a visible problem, a simple tool, and a man who understood both. Samuel restored the tension. Start feeding again. The crawler returned to speed. The thresher woke beneath it. Less than 4 minutes had passed. Charles looked toward the technician standing near the trapped tractor. The man was still speaking to the manufacturer by phone. What are they waiting for? Charles asked Cole. A replacement wheel speed sensor and a recovery crew. When? Tomorrow morning? If the road stays open. Charles looked back at Samuel. The crawler had developed a fault. Samuel had seen it, stopped, repaired it, and returned to work before the modern machine's support team had finished arranging transport. For the first time, Charles understood that simplicity was not the absence of technology. It was the ability to see what had failed. Another wagon arrived. Then another. The system found its rhythm. The binder cut only where the ground held firm. The small wagons followed the longer route around the wet strip. No wagon carried enough weight to break through the surface. At the yard, the crawler powered the thresher without moving an inch. Every part of Samuel's plan did less than Charles's tractor had been designed to do. Together, they continued the harvest. Rain began falling in scattered drops. Charles held out his hand. We are out of time. Samuel looked at the western field. 4 acres remained. Not yet. He advanced the throttle slightly. The crawler's engine deepened. The belt straightened. The thresher accelerated. Workers began feeding bundles faster. Charles watched the old flywheel turn. That morning, He had called the machine weak because it produced only a fraction of the modern tractor's horsepower. Now he saw the power differently. The crawler was not carrying its own enormous weight through unstable soil. It was not dragging a grain cart behind it. It was not spending energy on climate control, pumps, automated steering, or electronic systems. Almost every useful stroke of the engine passed into the belt. The machine did not have much power. It wasted very little of what it had. A stronger gust crossed the yard. The repaired belt began drifting toward the edge of the pulley. Samuel noticed. He moved the crawler forward less than an inch. The belt returned to center. Charles stared at him. "You moved the entire machine for that?" "That was the adjustment." "No sensor told you?" Samuel looked along the belt. "It told me." The fourth wagon entered the yard. Grain began pouring again. The crowd that had come to watch a technology demonstration was now carrying sacks, stacking straw, and guiding wagons. No one was laughing at the 1915 machine. No one was filming it as a joke. They were working around it. The crawler had become the center of the harvest. Charles looked toward his buried tractor one more time. It still possessed more power than every old machine in the yard combined. But the old machine had something his did not. A job it could still perform. The old crawler never entered the wet strip. That was the part Charles still struggled to accept. For years, he had measured a machine by what it could pull, how fast it could move, and how many jobs it could perform without stopping. Samuel's machine had done none of those things. It had not rescued the modern tractor. It had not crossed the deepest ground. It had not replaced 500 horsepower with 20. Instead, it had changed the question. The original question had been simple. How do we get the $475,000 tractor moving again? Samuel had replaced it with another. How do we keep the harvest moving without it? That change saved the afternoon. The fifth wagon reached the yard as the rain became steady. Workers unloaded bundles beneath a canvas shelter stretched beside the thresher. Grain poured into sacks. Straw accumulated in a growing pile behind the machine. The 1915 crawler continued driving the belt. Its engine no longer sounded weak. It sounded measured. One ignition followed another, with the same deliberate rhythm. Each stroke transferred through the flywheel into useful work. Charles stood near the grain outlet and checked the tally. "We are still behind," he said. Cole added another mark to the board. "Behind the original plan." Charles looked at him. "What other plan is there? The one that is still working." Charles turned away. Beyond the yard, the uncut grain bent beneath the wind. The binder had reached the final section, accessible from the high route. 3 acres remained near the wet strip. The shortest path crossed directly behind the trapped tractor. Samuel studied the field from beside the crawler. "We turn the binder north." Cole looked at the slope. "That section is narrow. It is firm. We lose another pass turning around. We lose the machine if we cross low." Charles approached them. "The moisture data says the northern edge is drier." Samuel nodded. "Then the data agrees with the field." Charles paused. It was the first time Samuel had acknowledged that the system was useful. "You trust the reading now?" "I trust it as one piece." Samuel pointed toward the ground. "The roots are thicker there. The land rises. The reeds stop. Your sensor shows less water. 4 signs say the same thing." Charles looked at the tablet. He had always wanted one decisive number. Samuel wanted agreement between several imperfect signs. The binder turned north. Its cutting bar entered the grain at an angle, leaving a triangular section behind. The route was less efficient, but the machine stayed on firm soil. The first drops became a steady curtain. Workers pulled their hats lower and continued feeding the thresher. Charles checked the clock. 35 minutes, until the heaviest part of the storm. "How much can we finish?" he asked. Samuel watched the wagons. "All of what reaches us." That is not an answer. It is the only honest one. The 6th wagon arrived overloaded. Bundles rose above the wooden sides. The wheels cut deeper tracks into the yard than the previous wagons had left. Samuel immediately reduced the crawler's throttle. The thresher slowed. The feeder shouted, "We can take more." "No," Samuel said. Charles stared at him. "We finally have enough material to run at capacity." Samuel pointed toward the wagon. "That load crossed soft ground." "So?" "So the next one will try to carry the same." He walked to the driver. "Half loads from now on." Charles followed. "That doubles the trips. It also keeps the wagons above ground. We are almost out of time." Samuel placed one hand on the wagon's side. This is how the first mistake started. Charles understood. The large tractor had entered the field because every decision had favored fewer trips, larger loads, and greater speed. Now the same pressure was returning. The equipment was different. The temptation was not. Charles looked at the deep marks beneath the wagon. "Half loads," he said. The driver nodded. Samuel returned to the crawler without comment. The seventh wagon arrived lighter. Then the eighth. The system slowed, but it remained intact. No wheel broke through the surface. No belt failed. No machine entered protection mode. Every part continued doing the smaller job assigned to it. Near the field, the binder reached the narrow northern corner. The operator stopped. A low section separated him from the final acre. He raised his arms toward the yard. Cole saw him. "That is it." Charles looked at the standing grain beyond the depression. "We can still cross." Samuel studied the route. The low area was only 15 yards wide. The binder was light, compared with the modern tractor. The rain had not yet formed standing water. Charles looked at Samuel. "You said the old machine could reach the work." "Not all work. The binder may make it." "It may. That crop will be flattened tonight." "Possibly." Charles stepped closer. "You refuse to take any risk." Samuel's expression hardened. "I have taken risks my entire life." "Then take this one." Samuel pointed toward the trapped tractor. "That was not risk. That was ignoring evidence." He looked back toward the binder. "Risk is when the outcome is uncertain after you have respected what you know." Charles waited. Samuel walked toward the depression. He pushed his stick into the ground at the edge. Firm. 2 steps farther. Soft. Then firmer again near the opposite side. The weak section was narrower than the wet strip where the tractor had sunk. But the rain was changing it quickly. Samuel looked at the binder's steel wheels. Then at the empty wagon waiting behind it. No wagon crosses. Charles frowned. "Then how do we move the crop? The binder cuts only." "And the grain? People carry the bundles to this side." Charles looked toward the remaining acre. "That will take the entire crew." "Yes." "The thresher stops while they do it." "Yes." Again. Samuel divided the work. The machine would cross light. The load would cross separately. No single part would carry more than the ground could support. The binder entered the depression. Its front wheels sank slightly. The operator kept the speed low. No sudden throttle. No spinning. The machine climbed the opposite side and reached the final grain. The crew crossed on foot. They carried the cut bundles back in pairs, placing them onto wagons waiting on firm ground. Charles joined them. His boots sank around the weak section. Rain ran down his neck. The bundle scratched his arms through his jacket. He carried it anyway. When he reached the wagon, Samuel was waiting. "You could have sent another machine," Charles said. Samuel took the bundle from him and learned nothing. The last wagon reached the thresher as thunder broke above the yard. The crawler was still running. The repaired belt still held. The workers fed the final bundles into the drum. Grain poured from the outlet in a narrowing stream. Then the last stalk disappeared. Samuel closed the throttle. The crawler slowed. The belt sagged. The thresher turned several final rotations before falling silent. For a moment, only rain remained. Cole checked the tally. "Not all of it," he said. Charles looked toward the small corner of grain still standing near the flooded strip. "How much?" "Less than half an acre." Charles looked at the sacks under the shelter. Nearly the entire accessible harvest had been saved. The $475,000 tractor remained in the field. The machine, built in 1915, stood in the yard, warm oil dripping slowly from one bearing. Charles faced Samuel. "So this is what you call beating it?" Samuel shook his head. "No." He pointed toward the workers. "The binder, the wagons, the thresher, and the sacks of grain. This is what I call finishing the work." Charles looked toward his modern tractor. That morning, he had believed the better machine was the one capable of doing the most. Now the machine that had done the most important work had never tried to do everything. The storm reached the farm 5 minutes after the thresher stopped. Rain struck the barn roof in hard. Uneven bursts. Wind pushed across the western field, flattening the reeds and bending the remaining grain almost to the ground. Workers pulled the last sacks beneath the shelter. Cole counted them twice. Charles stood beside him, soaked through, staring at the final number. It was lower than the original projection, but not by much. 86%. Cole said. Charles looked toward the trapped tractor. "And how much would we have saved if we had spent the afternoon trying to pull that out?" Cole did not answer. He did not need to. The recovery crew had not arrived. The replacement sensor had not arrived. The modern tractor still sat in the wet strip, silent beneath the rain. Samuel's old crawler stood in the yard with water running down its iron frame. The belt hung loose between the pulley and thresher. Steam rose faintly from the engine housing. Charles walked toward it. The crowd had mostly disappeared beneath tents and truck awnings. No one laughed now. A few farmers stood watching Samuel wipe rainwater from the exposed magneto. Charles looked at the machine. It nearly overheated. Samuel nodded. The load was high. The belt joint almost failed. It held. One bearing ran hot. We stopped before it seized. Charles folded his arms. So it was not reliable. Samuel looked up. It finished. Charles glanced toward the modern tractor. That one would have finished faster, if it had stayed above ground. The answer was quiet. Charles had no reply. Samuel opened the bearing cap and checked the grease inside. Rain struck his hat brim and ran down the collar of his coat. Charles watched him work. Every weakness in the old machine had been visible. The damaged belt could be seen. The hot bearing could be touched. The fuel mixture could be smelled. When something changed, Samuel changed the way the machine was used. The modern tractor systems had measured more. But once it stopped, no one on the farm could repair the problem with what they had. Its power remained locked behind sensors, software, specialized parts, and wet ground. Charles looked at the sacks under the shelter. "You knew this system would work?" "No." Charles frowned. "You spoke as if you did." "I knew each part could work." Samuel tightened the bearing cap. "That is different." The old crawler had not offered certainty. It had offered options. If one wagon sank, 3 others remained. If the binder stopped, the crew could carry bundles. If the belt failed, it could be shortened. If the machine overheated, it could be paused and restarted. No single failure controlled the entire harvest. Charles looked toward the trapped tractor. His modern system had been faster because it concentrated many jobs into one machine. It had also concentrated the risk. "When did you learn to work this way?" he asked. Samuel wiped his hands. "When we could not afford to replace everything that broke." Charles expected bitterness in the answer. There was none. Samuel continued. "You learn to separate the job from the tool. You learn which part must happen now, and which part can wait. You learn not to spend every resource solving the most expensive problem." Charles looked at the field. The tractor was worth more than all the grain they had saved that afternoon. That was why he had wanted to rescue it first. But the tractor could wait through the storm. The crop could not. He had confused price with urgency. Thunder rolled above the barn. A farmer near the shelter raised his voice. "Samuel." Samuel turned. The drive belt had begun sagging under the weight of rainwater. One edge was touching the muddy ground. He walked over. released the tension completely, and helped two workers carry the belt inside. Charles followed. The belt was heavy and wet. The repaired joint remained intact. One of the younger farmers ran his hand across it. This thing did all that? Samuel shook his head. It transferred the power. The young man looked confused. Samuel pointed toward the crawler. That made the power. Then toward the thresher. That used it. Then toward the wagons and workers. They kept material moving. Finally, he pointed toward the field. And the root kept everything from sinking. He laid the belt across two wooden supports. No single part saved the harvest. Charles stood in the doorway. That was the lesson he had resisted all day. He had wanted one machine to be the answer. One purchase. One system. One piece of technology powerful enough to eliminate uncertainty. Samuel's method looked primitive because it depended on many imperfect parts. But those parts could be rearranged when conditions changed. The system bent without stopping. Outside, the rain intensified. Water ran through the ruts around the trapped tractor. The machine appeared lower than before. Though it was difficult to tell through the storm, Charles took out his phone and called the recovery company. "When can you reach us?" The answer was brief. Road conditions had worsened. The crew would not arrive until the following morning. Charles looked toward Samuel. "They cannot come tonight." Samuel nodded. "Then the tractor waits. What if it sinks farther?" "It probably will." "What if water reaches the axle housing?" "We inspect it before starting." Charles looked frustrated. "You say these things as though there is nothing we can do." "There is plenty we can do." Samuel pointed toward the drainage ditch beside the wet strip. "We keep water moving away from the machine. We unload the grain cart. We secure the hitch. We mark the safe route for the recovery crew." Charles looked toward the field. "In this rain?" Samuel picked up his coat. "The storm does not excuse poor preparation." Cole gathered 6 workers. They carried shovels, ropes, boards, and lanterns toward the northern rise. The old crawler did not move. Its work for the day was finished. Charles walked beside Samuel through the rain. When they reached the edge of the wet strip, Samuel stopped the crew. "No one enters from the south." He pointed toward the firmer northern route. Single file. Step where the person ahead stepped. The workers moved carefully. They opened the shallow drainage path and removed loose debris. 2 men reached the grain cart from the high side and began unloading the small amount of grain still inside. Charles joined them. Mud covered his boots. His hands slipped on the wet sacks. No one treated him like the owner of the farm. For that hour, he was simply another man, carrying weight away from ground that could no longer support it. When the final sack reached firm ground, Samuel checked the tractor one last time. Rainwater ran from the body panels. The machine looked defeated. Charles stood beside him. "You still believe your machine beat mine?" Samuel looked back toward the yard. The 1,915 crawler sat beneath the shelter. "Quiet now." "No. Everyone else will. They will say what makes the better story." Charles looked at the sacks stacked inside the barn. "What is the true story?" Samuel turned toward the storm. "The true story is that your tractor was the strongest machine here." He pointed toward the saved grain. And strength was not what the day required. By morning, the storm had passed. The $475,000 tractor still sat in the wet strip, lower than before, but undamaged. A recovery crew arrived with timber mats, winches, and a tracked support vehicle. They approached from the northern rise, following the route Samuel had marked. The tractor was freed slowly. No cheering followed. The important work had already been done. Inside the barn, sacks of grain stood in neat rows. Most of the harvest had been saved before the storm. Charles walked past them and stopped beside Samuel's 1,915 crawler. The old machine was quiet now. Mud covered its tracks. Oil darkened the frame. The repaired belt hung nearby. "You saved 86%. Charles said. Samuel shook his head. "We did. Charles looked toward the workers. The binder had cut the crop. The wagons had carried it. The thresher had processed it. The crew had kept every part moving. The crawler had not replaced the modern tractor. It had connected the system. Charles placed one hand on the old machine's frame. "I called this useless." Samuel looked at him. "You called it useless because it could not do everything." Charles glanced toward the modern tractor being pulled onto firm ground. "And mine failed because I expected it to." Samuel nodded. The recovery crew started the engine. The powerful tractor came alive again. Nothing inside it had truly been broken. But the day had proven something Charles could no longer ignore. The strongest machine on the farm had stopped the moment the ground refused to support it. The oldest machine had continued because Samuel gave it a job suited to its limits. A reporter approached Charles. "Which tractor won?" Charles looked at the two machines. The modern tractor was faster, stronger, and more precise. The 1,915 crawler had kept the harvest moving. He answered carefully. "The machine that finished the work." Wegslater. The two tractors stood in the same equipment yard. The $475,000 machine had returned to work. Its software had been checked, its sensors cleaned, and its tires repaired. Samuel's 1,915 crawler remained beside the old barn. Charles walked around it slowly. "I will buy it," he said. "Name your price." Samuel shook his head. "You still think its value belongs to the machine?" Charles looked toward the modern tractor. "Then what did I pay for?" "Speed, precision, power. And what does this one have?" Samuel placed a hand on the old iron frame. "A different purpose." Charles no longer saw rust and weak horsepower. He saw a machine light enough to remain on firm ground, simple enough to repair in minutes, and flexible enough to power another tool when the original plan failed. His modern tractor was still the better machine for most of the farm, but it was no longer the only machine on which the farm depended. Charles created new rules. Heavy tractors would avoid the wet strip. Smaller equipment would remain available for weak ground. Old waterways and reed lines would be added to the digital maps. Every harvest plan would include a backup system. The next time rain threatened, the crew used both machines. The modern tractor handled the high fields quickly. The old crawler-powered equipment beside the barn. No one called it useless again. Before leaving, Charles asked Samuel one final question. "Did your machine beat mine?" Samuel looked toward the two tractors. "No." He pointed toward the wet field. "Your machine lost when you asked it to do every job." Then he pointed toward the barn, the wagons, and the saved grain. "Mine succeeded because we asked it to do one job. It could still finish." Charles nodded. The lesson was not that old machines were better than new ones. It was that strength without judgment could become weakness, while a limited tool used wisely could keep an entire farm alive.